Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this hearing. This is a special oversight hearing of the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. Certainly, I'm very happy to be here in northern Michigan. I'm sure all of our witnesses and everyone here are enjoying a wonderful northern Michigan day. There's no better place to be than here. And I hope that we have some great testimony and a great conversation, and I appreciate the attendance here today for this hearing. I'd like to, first off, to take a moment to thank the Dennis Museum for their gracious facilitation of this hearing, and I hope you all have an opportunity to tour some of the exhibits here afterwards, after the hearing. Not during the hearing, but after the hearing. It would be great to tour those exhibits. I'd also want to acknowledge the many comments and questions that have been submitted for the hearing record from the community. We'll keep the hearing record open for a few days following this hearing as well. For anyone who would like to submit any other comments or questions, the questions will be submitted to the witnesses for answers. All that is being put forward will be part of the permanent record in the U.S. Senate on this very important topic. I had the opportunity to read through many of these last night, and I'm grateful for all of them. I heard from the Chippewa-Ottawa Resource Authority, representing very diverse tribes, including the Bay Mills Indian Community, Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians, Little River Band of Ottawa Indians, Little Traverse Bay Band of Ottawa Indians, and Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians. Also comments from the International Union of Operating Engineers, Michigan Technological University, the Michigan League of Conservation Voters, the Sierra Club for Love of Water, Michigan Environmental Council, Groundwork Center for Our Resilient Communities, Great Lakes Business Network, Michigan Pipeline Petroleum Task Force. And I could certainly go on with a long list of comments that have been presented, but rather I think I will mention what I think is what almost all of the stakeholders felt in reading the writings, and that was Mayor Jim Carruthers here of Traverse City, and he wrote, quote, "Our economy relies on our clean, fresh water, and if that were to change, life as we know it in northern Michigan would also change, devastating what makes life so special here." And I think so that is why we're here today, and first and foremost to talk about the Great Lakes. And here in Michigan, as you've heard from the audience, the Great Lakes is a way of life for us. It's really part of our DNA, and next to our people, without question, the most important and precious resource that we have. Not only do the lakes provide drinking water for 40 million people, but they're an economic engine for our state and our nation, supporting more than 500,000 jobs in Michigan alone. From commercial shipping and agriculture to fishing, boating, tourism, the Great Lakes are deeply intertwined with our state and our people. We know that an oil spill in the Great Lakes would be absolutely catastrophic for our environment and for our economy. As ranking member of the subcommittee with jurisdiction over the federal pipeline safety policy, I called this hearing to take a closer look at the federal and industry response to the April vessel strike in the Straits of Mackinac, to get some answers to some potentially tough questions that I'm often asked by Michigan residents, not just here in Traverse City, but in every area of the state. It doesn't matter where I travel in the state, people always bring up Line 5 as part of their concerns. We know that Michiganders are both deeply invested and deeply concerned about the continued existence of Line 5, an aging pipeline in the Straits of Mackinac, one of the most vulnerable locations in the entire Great Lakes. If you're looking for the worst absolute place for an oil disaster to occur, it would be the Straits of Mackinac. And I have several statements for the record that have been sent, as I've already mentioned. While pipelines are typically a very safe and efficient method of transporting energy resources that we all use, the reality is accidents do happen. As Michigan Tech's recent risk analysis noted, a Line 5 oil spill in the Straits of Mackinac could reach hundreds of miles of shoreline in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ontario. It could cost the state nearly $2 billion, some estimates much higher, to say nothing of the countless lives and livelihoods around the Great Lakes that would be shattered as a result. Some have called this analysis purely hypothetical, but after the most expensive pipeline break in the history of the United States on land on the Kalamazoo River, Michiganders know better than anyone else what happens when a pipeline fails. I certainly don't want to wait until the next disaster to consider what we have done to prevent it. That's why I've authored provisions in legislation such as the 2016 Pipes Act, and in the past and present Coast Guard reauthorizations that are intended to protect the Great Lakes, bolster pipeline safety and response planning, and prevent harm. Mr. Elliott, as the administrator of PHMSA, I certainly appreciated working with you last April towards a temporary shutdown of the damaged Line 5 during the severe weather. I appreciate your efforts there and your willingness to actively engage with folks from Enbridge. This hearing is intended in that same spirit to invite testimony that will inform our understanding of safe pipeline operations, to prevent another disaster like the Kalamazoo River spill, and to ensure the Great Lakes are protected for generations to come. This hearing is an opportunity for Michiganders who want answers to hear directly from each of the witnesses. And so again, I want to thank you for your willingness to be here. First, Administrator Elliott, who is the administrator for the Pipelines and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration in Washington, D.C. He is the gentleman in charge of ensuring that our pipelines are indeed safe all across the country. Minister Elliott, I want to extend my appreciation for your leadership and your responsiveness to my questions in the days and weeks following the vessel strike in April. And thank you for being here today. And I want to particularly thank you for taking another day in Michigan tomorrow to visit the Kalamazoo spill site. And I look forward to your testimony and our continued work together. Rear Admiral Noonan, I also want to thank you for your swift response. Rear Admiral Noonan is the 9th District Commander for the United States Coast Guard, responsible for the Great Lakes region. And I want to again thank you for your swift response when I asked for answers from the Coast Guard back in April. You brought many folks together to answer those questions and immediately responded, and we appreciate your service in District 9 and keeping us safe here in the Great Lakes as well. And again, thank you to all the men and women of the Coast Guard who are keeping us safe today, and the station here in Traverse City and stations all across the Great Lakes.
Thanks, sir.
And Mr. Lundgren, I'm grateful to have NOAA's presence here. Mr. Lundgren is the Emergency Response Division Chief, Office of Response and Restoration from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in D.C. I appreciate your expert scientific expertise on oil response and restoration, which will be interesting to hear in this hearing. I've long been concerned that our scientific capacity and understanding of oil in freshwater systems is not simply at the same level of our understanding of oil's performance in saltwater systems, which means the danger here in the Great Lakes are even greater than they are in the ocean, as significant as that is. And I look forward to hearing your comments here today. So enough about introductions. Let's get to some testimony. Administrator Elliott, if you could start us off with your testimony. And we do have a clock. If you could try to contain those within 5 minutes, we'd appreciate it.
Thank you, and good morning, Senator Peters. Appreciate the opportunity to testify here today about pipeline safety in Michigan. During my 40-year railroad career, I responded to dozens of derailments and other incidents to learn from what had happened and to work to improve safety for employees and the public. That's also the reason why I accepted my current role at PHMSA. Why I accepted my current role at PHMSA, because I remain committed to public safety. PHMSA's mission is to protect people and the environment by improving the safe transportation of energy products and other hazardous materials that are essential to our daily lives. Our ultimate goal is to have zero incidents. Although we're here today because of concerns about pipeline safety, I must acknowledge, as you did, that pipeline safety has greatly improved over the last 2 decades. Today, energy products are safely moved by pipeline 99.997% of the time. And part of that improvement is due to PHMSA's responsibility to create and enforce pipeline safety regulations and to inspect pipeline operators and systems across our nation. But we're not here to talk about past safety accomplishments. We're here to address today's concerns. During my 10 months at PHMSA, I've reviewed many of our responses to pipeline incidents, including those leading up to this hearing, and I'm satisfied that PHMSA's actions were prompt, thorough, and effective. But let me summarize why I believe that. PHMSA's action after the major Enbridge pipeline failure occurring in 2010 included corrected action orders that directed the operator to review its integrity management requirements for the entire U.S. portion of its Lakehead pipeline system. Enbridge reported spending $2.5 billion to comply with PHMSA's orders. System-wide testing required by PHMSA led to the repair of numerous areas of concerns before these faults could cause further releases. Enbridge ultimately replaced the entire Line 6B pipeline after assessments revealed integrity concerns. These incidents have also raised concern over the integrity of Enbridge Line 5, especially the segment that traverses the Straits of Mackinac. Recently, gaps in support under the pipeline, areas of coating loss, and dents resulting from an anchor drag have deepened this concern. In each case, PHMSA acted decisively upon notification and executing its industry oversight function. PHMSA engineers reviewed the best, most current inspection data available and found no evidence that structural integrity was compromised to a point necessitating a full shutdown of the pipeline. But to ensure the accuracy of our own assessment for the lines in this very sensitive area, PHMSA took the extra step of engaging the Oak Ridge National Laboratory to conduct an independent assessment of the data. Their expert, after careful review, confirmed PHMSA's initial findings. It was also noted that the twin 20-inch diameter lines running along the bottom of the Straits were designed to a higher than normal standard with pipe thickness 3 times that of other lines in the Lakehead system and of seamless construction, eliminating the risk of cracking along longitudinal welds, a big concern of ours. These design factors came into play after the April anchor drag that caused 3 dents in the pipeline. PHMSA's inspection and evaluation of video footage and data from multiple inline inspections conducted both before and after the incident did not identify damage sufficient to warrant complete pipeline shutdown. However, PHMSA engineers evaluated and closely monitored the plan for ensuring ongoing line integrity, including reducing internal pipeline pressure until completion of repairs. And Enbridge recently completed the dent repairs to PHMSA's satisfaction. Since the first incidents, PHMSA has performed more than 450 days of work focused on the safety of the Enbridge Lakehead system, including many days on sites at the Straits of Mackinac. We're also conducting currently ongoing comprehensive integrative inspection of their entire Lakehead system. During all of this, PHMSA has worked closely with Enbridge in the state of Michigan. My staff has praised the Michigan Public Service Commission as among the most professional organizations that they work with. I must also acknowledge the responsiveness and professionalism of the U.S. Coast Guard. We have some excellent safety partners in these organizations. Senator Peters, we pledge to enhance those relationships and to communicate regularly with you to assure that we're working diligently and efficiently to ensure pipeline safety in Michigan. PHMSA strives to ensure the operators maintain their infrastructure to the highest levels and that they protect against its risk. But let me be clear. It is the operators that have the constant proximity, the resources, and the primary responsibility for ensuring the safety of their assets. We'll continue to hold operators accountable for safe operations of their pipelines, and we'll continue to pursue improvements through as many avenues as we can, from inspection and enforcement to education, technology, and innovation. Thank you, and I'm happy to respond to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ader. Elliott, Admiral Noonan, love to hear from you.
Good morning, Chairman Peters. It is my pleasure to be here today to discuss the Coast Guard's oil spill response plans and capabilities on the Great Lakes, and to provide detail on how the Coast Guard responded to the dielectric fluid discharge in the Straits of Mackinac. I ask that my written testimony be entered into the record.
It will be. Thank you.
The Coast Guard has broad authorities that reside in a variety of statutes, and we complement these with well-established interagency and industry relationships to provide rapid and effective response in the event of a release or spill in the marine environment. Guided by the National Contingency Plan, the Coast Guard and its response partners focused national planning and preparedness concepts on a specific geographic scope for each federal region. Further bolstering the national response capability in the Great Lakes, the Coast Guard enjoys a long history of cooperation with the Canadian Coast Guard. Under the auspices of the bilateral Canada-United States Joint Marine Pollution Contingency Plan, the U.S. and Canadian Coast Guards have established a coordinated system for response preparation and planning in the contiguous waters along shared marine borders. These international plans proved invaluable to responders during the 2015 response to the Argo, a barge that sank in Lake Erie in 1937 that began leaking hazardous substances. As a learning organization, the Coast Guard couples lessons learned from real-world responses with research and development to apply the latest technology and best practices to marine spill response efforts. As part of a multi-year Coast Guard research and development project centered in the Straits, we recently issued our first ever Federal On-Scene Coordinator's Guide to Oil and Ice, which provides responders the best available options for addressing oil spills in winter conditions. Through further research and development, along with interagency and industry partnerships, we are addressing oil spill research needs unique to the Great Lakes to improve response capability throughout the region. Along the same lines, the Coast Guard administers the Oil Spill Removal Organization, or OSRO, classification program. Through this program, the Coast Guard provides clear standards for OSROs to follow as they work together to foster a robust network of marine environmental response providers in each captain of the port zone. To supplement industry's response capabilities, the Coast Guard maintains an inventory of oil spill response equipment throughout the Great Lakes region, which is readily available for deployment. In the event of a spill in a location where there are limited OSRO resources, this equipment allows the Coast Guard to act promptly to contain the spill. As you know, in April 2018, Coast Guard Sector Sault Ste. Marie responded to a spill of dielectric fluid in the Straits of Mackinac. After receiving a report of the discharge, the commander of Coast Guard Sector Sault Ste. Marie initiated an interagency response in accordance with the Northern Michigan Area Contingency Plan and established a unified command. Under the supervision and direction of the unified command, OSROs contracted by the responsible party worked over several weeks to remove residual dielectric fluid from the cables and cap them. If there is a bright spot to this unfortunate event, it provides a fine example of federal, tribal, state, local, and industry cooperation through both advanced planning and execution to respond to an environmental threat. The Coast Guard is dedicated to the protection and preservation of the resources in the Great Lakes region. Through an established network of partners across all spectrums of both the public and private sectors, the Coast Guard continues to explore and develop optimal response and mitigation methods for oil spill discharges and hazardous material releases. With the sustained support of the administration, Congress, and the public, we will continue to protect the people and the valuable resources of the Great Lakes region. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on these important matters, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Admiral. Mr. Lindgren.
Senator Peters, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm pleased to testify as Chief of the Emergency Response Division within NOAA's Office of Response and Restoration on NOAA's role in oil spill preparedness, response, and restoration in the Great Lakes region. The Great Lakes are a national treasure and a critical feature of the region's economy and natural environment, from transportation and recreation to wildlife and habitat. Clearly, this very important freshwater resource deserves the highest level of protection and care. When these resources are threatened by spills, my office at NOAA provides expert leadership, training, and time-critical services. NOAA has three primary response and restoration roles: spill response, damage assessment, and interagency coordination and leadership as mandated by the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 and the National Contingency Plan. I'll speak to each in a little bit more detail. First, spill response. In response to a spill in the Great Lakes, the Coast Guard may call on our Scientific Support Coordinator, or SSC, co-located at the 9th Coast Guard District in Cleveland, for scientific input, advice, and products for critical decisions. The SSC also connects responders with additional NOAA services for more complicated spill scenarios. Second, damage assessment. When oil spills damage natural resource, NOAA conducts a natural resources damage assessment with other natural resource trustees on behalf of the public. This process assesses the damage and plans restoration actions to compensate for those natural resource losses, including lost recreational use. We have a Great Lakes Regional Resource Coordinator to lead the agency's assessment activities in the region, and NOAA's Damage Assessment, Remediation, and Restoration Program does this work in collaboration with other federal, state, and tribal trustees. Third, interagency coordination and leadership. NOAA represents the Department of Commerce in spill response decisions through the 15-agency National Response Team and the Federal, State, Tribal, Interagency Region 5 Regional Response Team covering the lakes. We also serve as one of the 3 rotating vice chairs of the Interagency Coordinating Committee on Oil Pollution Research. Moving to regional collaborations, we maintain strong connections to other NOAA programs in the region, such as the NOAA Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory, the National Weather Service, Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, and several others. We draw on their expertise, models, data, and services in our work. Rear Admiral Gallaudet, the acting NOAA administrator, wanted to relay that he paid a visit to the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary just this past week in Alpena, Michigan, with its economically and historically significant collection of shipwrecks that you and he discussed in the recent Blue Economy hearing. And then beyond NOAA, we collaborate widely with other state, federal, and international partners with roles that relate to our response and restoration charge. I'd also like to highlight NOAA's work on models, tools, data, and data systems. In addition to those strong regional connections I mentioned, our regional coordinators rely on a broader team of multidisciplinary oil and chemical spill experts. These scientists develop and maintain important model and data systems that bring the latest science to bear on the challenges of response and restoration. Our models and tools include NOME, that serves as our oil transport and fate model, IRMA, our real-time mapping application used by the Coast Guard as a common operating picture for environmental response, and Diver, our powerful solution to manage complex environmental data. The regional Great Lakes Diver was recently tailored to meet the needs of the St. Louis River area of concern in collaboration with Minnesota and Wisconsin. One NOAA geospatial product called the Environmental Sensitivity Index, or ESI, compiles shoreline, biological, and human use sensitivity information so that appropriate oil spill response actions can be planned. The Great Lakes ESI maps were made in the late 80s and early 90s, and as is now the case nationally, the ESI data are updated as resources from partners allow. I'm pleased to indicate that NOAA recently received funding from the EPA through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative to update ESI maps for both the Straits of Mackinac and the St. Clair-Detroit River system. Preparedness and training is another important NOAA function. We train responders on oil and chemical spill science. In 2015, NOAA contributed significantly to a collaborative planning, training, and exercise series focusing on the Straits of Mackinac. And just 2 weeks ago, NOAA conducted a 3-day course on assessing oil shorelines in Mackinac City. In conclusion, NOAA serves a key role in applying science operationally to spill response and restoration. NOAA's suite of products, services, and research, combined with the expertise of our personnel, are critical in mitigating harm, allocating resources, and restoring affected coastal environments in the unfortunate event of a spill. All contributions important for protecting the Great Lakes. Thank you, Chairman, for inviting me to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you, and thank you to all 3 of our witnesses for your opening statements. I'd like to open my questions by going back to the incident that we had in April, because I think there are a lot of lessons learned. You talked about some of those lessons in your testimony, but I think there were also some gaps that I'm very concerned about. And Admiral Noonan, I want to direct this question to you. The Coast Guard has primary responsibility, as you mentioned in your testimony, as a unified command to clean up release of a substance in the environment. In this case, it was the release of electric transmission fluid from the lines. And we know that we had an anchor strike on those lines as well as an anchor strike on Line 5. And just to put this in context, I think everybody in the audience knows this is everybody's nightmare scenario where you have an anchor strike that damages these pipes to bring it open. So my question, though, is to you, is that to what extent, although your focus as Unified Command was on the cable break, which had released material, to what extent was Line 5 a focus for the command structure?
Chairman Peters, the Unified Command, as you mentioned, did stand up for the mineral oil spill. In the Unified Command, we also coordinated with Enbridge, with PHMSA, with the state of Michigan. So they were all there participating in the Unified Command setup, and were able to provide the most up-to-date information, including Enbridge was able to do some diagnostic testing in their line, which determined that there was not a breach in their line. We also, within hours of the report of the mineral oil leak, we were able to do overflights. So we were able to overfly the area and did that daily along with shore side and waterborne patrols that there was never an indication of any sheen. So that is the linkage, was really bringing all the partners together in that Unified Command to look at the whole area.
So the Unified Command was able to do a quick assessment, and you're stating for the record that Line 5 was a priority part of that Unified Command to see if that was indeed damaged. Did it go beyond just Enbridge's assessment?
It went, we had the, PHMSA was part of the, participated in the event, so we had the federal regulator of pipelines, we had Enbridge doing diagnostic testing, and we had the overflights and shore and waterborne patrols. So that was our comprehensive look.
So what I have heard, and so I would like to have your response on the record, is that although there was internal diagnostics done of the pipeline, you never know for sure what's happening until you actually get eyes on. You have to have visual inspection to get a really 100% sense of what's happening there. I have heard that is because the focus was on the cables for the Coast Guard, that may have delayed actually getting visual inspection onto Line 5. Would that be your assessment, that it would have happened quicker had it not been for the focus on the cable strike?
The Unified Command, I don't think I would explain it like that. I think that the Unified Command standing up did provide quite a bit of focus on the entire region and any other issues that may have occurred. So I think that the diagnostic testing, the ability for Enbridge and PHMSA to be able to determine if there was any breach in their line was probably the most important piece. As far as visual inspections, I don't think that was needed for the initial response. Eventually, we did have some ROVs that were able to do visual inspections, but that's not typically critical for the early response efforts.
So, and I think that's an important distinction, but one has me a little concerned, is that your initial inspection is that there wasn't a breach at that moment. You had flyovers, you had Enbridge reporting it, and then you turn your focus to cleaning up what you know is actually in the water, which is the cable strike and the material from that. So the strike on the pipeline could, though, have been a ticking time bomb at that point because we had not had visual inspection. But that was not the focus of your Unified Command. Based on your authorities, I'm not critical of your work there and the men and women from the Coast Guard, but that's just in line with the way your authorities work.
Well, the way that our authorities work as a federal on-scene coordinator is primarily in the response to a spill, but the way that we get to that place really leads up to it in all the planning and preparation we do ahead of time with our area committee. The Northern Michigan Area Committee has over 50 participants. That's everything from federal, state, local, industry, tribal, environmental participation. So all of the planning we do, all of the exercises we do, all of the communications we have, I think support having an overall strong focus on that area and how we would respond. And so I think we were in a very good position to have the right people to determine if there was an issue, and if there was, we were completely stood up.
Okay. Administrator Elliott, in this incident in April, do you feel that PHMSA had the available needed legal authority to compel Enbridge to take action back in April if you felt it was appropriate? Do you have the legal authority to do that?
I do, and we have several levels, Senator, that we can follow, from emergency order authority to corrective action orders to safety orders. So we have several means at our disposal that allow us to work with the operator, including shutdown if warranted.
So including a shutdown. So could you walk us through the process that your agency uses to determine whether or not to exercise that authority, particularly a shutdown?
Well, in this specific case, Senator, so the anchor strike occurred April 1st, and it was several days later, April 3rd, I believe, that Enbridge first became aware of impact or suspected impact to their pipe.
Several days after the impact, they became aware of it?
Yes, I think it was on the 3rd that they became aware of it. They notified PHMSA of their suspicion. Enbridge was working then with our engineering staff. They took the steps of, at that point, shutting down the pipeline and doing some internal control room tests to see if there were any anomalies that indicated that because of the anchor strikes there were any integrity issues with the pipeline. Subsequent, they started the pipeline back up, and that was for a good reason. One, then they did a pressure test of the line, followed by some fairly sophisticated inline inspection capability. And I do want to stress that in this case, given the depth of the pipeline and the ability not to get a visual inspection of the pipeline as early as perhaps we would like, the use of inline inspection tools gives us the best, our engineering staff gives us the best understanding, and I think Enbridge as well, as what kind of anomalies existed. It was through these inline inspection runs that Enbridge performed that they were able to actually identify the dents. Enbridge subsequently after that continued to perform some additional tests and calculations. They ultimately were able to bring in a remote operated vehicle that was actually the first physical examination of the outside pipeline. And then, of course, after that, as you know, we were able to get, Enbridge was able to get some divers down to actually do some more physical, closer up assessment of the pipeline. So it was that information that was fed to our engineering staff, working with them on where they were at in lowering the pressure of the line, that made our determination that we weren't going to issue an order at that point to shut the line down.
Well, I want to get to the visual inspection in a moment, because it did take quite a bit of time for that to happen, which I believe was completely unacceptable for the long time that was involved. But before getting into some of the details of how we can expedite that in the future, if that's necessary, first want to know how can, because it sounds as if Enbridge voluntarily reports a lot of information, if I'm hearing you correctly, they're reporting that. To what extent can that actually be independently verified by your inspectors and other staff? Or are we just taking the word of Enbridge, or are we actually verifying that?
Well, Senator, we're verifying the data that Enbridge provides, and we do not independently do those inline inspections, so we have to use the data that's available from the operators. Our engineering team will look at that data. They will consult with, in this case, and with Enbridge operators to help make our decision.
So your folks were on site for Line 5 early on, actually verifying those tests?
We did send inspection staff up to work both in the incident command and to do consultation with Enbridge.
Part of the unified command. How quickly were they on site?
I think it was probably several days after our first notification on the 3rd.
Several days.
Yes.
So, several days. So I'm asking these questions because I also want to make sure that we're coordinating properly between Coast Guard, PHMSA, all the agencies, which is important, as the Admiral mentioned, but also has to be done on a very timely basis, obviously, because if it is, although you immediately assess, as the Admiral has testified, you immediately assess whether or not there's a strike, and that's the prudent thing to do immediately. But I'm concerned that we had these two operations that were going on with a primary focus of the known spill, which does make sense, but we have a unique situation here with a potentially catastrophic break that could have occurred. And so that's what leads to my questions related to the visual inspection, which my understanding took 2.5 weeks or so before that occurred. So my question is, why was there a need to have two different ROVs to be ordered? One ordered by the Coast Guard to assess the cable damage, which came in, and another one ordered by Enbridge to separately align. Why wouldn't we just get ROV down there as quickly as possible and do both? What prevented that from happening? Either, maybe Admiral Noonan, because my understanding that there needed to be two different ROVs. Is that accurate?
Chairman Peters, the ROV were ordered as needed by either the responsible party, in this case was American Transmission. Enbridge could separately order an ROV to inspect their lines, or perhaps PHMSA. When we look at our response plans and the training and how we respond, typically ROVs are not necessarily a required piece of that right up front. And so we use all the tools that we have readily available that I mentioned. In this case, the diagnostic testing. For the utility line, they knew fairly quickly that the utility was severed, so that was part of what was used. And like I said, the Coast Guard used many of the tools that we have, including overflights and shore and on-water patrols every day. So the ROV is not necessarily part of most immediate responses. ROVs are not located everywhere in the country, so that just becomes part of the follow-up review and further investigation.
Do you think 2.5 weeks is quick enough?
I think ultimately the work that was done leading up to the ROVs, I think the ROV would not have changed our response. I think we had very good information to do our initial response. And like I said, all the players that you would want to be participating in a response of any kind in the Straits were right there on scene. So I don't think that was a critical need. It was nice to have, and it did ultimately show what we knew to begin with, and it was definitely helpful in some of the follow-on actions to do final repairs and things like that.
Administrator Elliott, do you think 2.5 weeks is sufficient? Is that quick enough?
Well, certainly we would like to have seen something more swift, but again, Enbridge had indicated that they had ordered up a ROV to do the sites. It ultimately was on site, and they did their inspection on the 17th. Perhaps going back to the Admiral's comments, part of it's the availability of the equipment and the operators to be able to provide the necessary high-resolution inspection that we need at the kind of depths that we were dealing with here. But certainly, sooner is better in this case.
So do we need to be rethinking about how quickly we require getting eyes on, particularly in an incident like we saw in April?
Well, my assessment would be is that specifically in instances where we know that the construction of the pipeline, in this case, over 240 feet at the bottom of a waterway, creates some very normal problems with our ability to respond promptly. So it's probably something that we could look at. Yes, sir.
So, Admiral Noonan, you mentioned in your testimony the equipment that the Coast Guard has ready. But let me first off say that we know the primary responsibility for cleanup is the company that is operating the pipeline or the spill incident. The Coast Guard steps in when that operator is not able to do it to make sure that it gets cleaned up because of the catastrophic damage that could be done, whether in the Straits or any other spill anywhere in the country. So could you be more specific? What kind of equipment does the Coast Guard have standing up and ready to respond within 24 hours? If we had an accident in the Straits of Mackinac, how much equipment could you have there within 24 hours?
Chairman, if you look around the Great Lakes, there are OSROs and industry materials, booming, absorbent pads, vacuum trucks, all throughout the Great Lakes. The Coast Guard also, kind of on its own volition, to be able to supplement that, especially in areas where our plans show that we might need additional equipment. Those are strategically placed, and they would be things like booming equipment, absorbent equipment, things that you would need immediately to protect sensitive areas or to contain a spill as needed. But really the primary materials being brought to the scene are going to be those OSROs that we certify from a Coast Guard perspective.
And how quickly could you get them to the Straits?
In each scenario, it could be a little bit different. Some OSROs are able to respond as quickly as an hour, some 6 to 8. I would say typically you would see things on scene within 12 hours, I would say usually at the longest.
So as I remember in April, there wasn't significant ice at the time, although the Straits ice up pretty dramatically during the winter, but there wasn't significant icing except along the coastline. Is that accurate, Admiral?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Are there, it's my understanding that the Coast Guard has the capability for a response to ice conditions, but it remains somewhat limited, and there's certainly a lot more we need to know about cleaning up a spill during ice conditions as well. How concerned were you about potential ice in the Straits, and how concerned are you in the future should there be complete ice cover as to how difficult that will be for a unified command to bring an appropriate response?
The icing conditions, the cold conditions definitely add another layer of complexity and challenge to any type of response. And as I mentioned in my oral statement, this is something over the last several years in particular, the Research and Development Center that the Coast Guard runs, along with many partners that we have in academia, even international partners, have begun looking very closely at how do you respond in icing conditions, not only identifying and collecting the oil, but also protecting our responders. So that research and development is ongoing, not only developing new technologies, but just refining some of our procedures that we would use our current materials to operate in ice.
So both Administrator Elliott and Admiral Noonan, so just give me your realistic assessment. Let's say that worst case scenario happened and Line 5 was indeed ruptured by the anchor at that time. Do you think we had enough equipment on site? Could we have done an effective response? Mr. Elliott?
Well, Senator, I think based on the information we have with our role to review oil spill plans, working in conjunction with our colleagues in the Coast Guard to help understand the dynamics, I think depending on the circumstances, that the plan in place would provide adequate coverage in responding to the spill. Now, there are a lot of dynamics with what could possibly happen, but I think at least the requirements of the spill plan are to provide response to a worst case scenario.
Admiral, do you agree with that?
Chairman, I would agree. A spill that you're describing is the exact worst case scenario that we have been trying to prevent. We've been working to prepare in case it happens. And so it would not catch us unprepared, because that is what we have been very much working on, both from full-scale exercises, before that, tabletop exercises, making sure that we have the right equipment in place, the right partnerships in place. So, and it's not to say that we're not going to continue to learn. We're going to continue to evolve in technologies and procedures and partnerships. But our 50-member area committee, that is our primary worst-case scenario. So I feel that that's what we've been preparing for in case that happens. And I think the preventative measures will hopefully be able to prevent such a spill.
So you have this assessment, but it's always, and I gave you a hypothetical, so I realize the limitations of that. But we also assume that you, according to your response, that we had good conditions to actually clean up a site, as you have in the Straits. So we all know that the weather conditions in the Straits can be very challenging for navigation, can be very challenging if you had to do a cleanup of a spill of some sort. In fact, Mr. Lundgren, within that time, we had a pretty severe storm that you were monitoring from NOAA that I know. In fact, I have some of the wave responses here. I've been looking at this chart here. There's a lot of red on that chart. I think that's bad, usually, and other colors that happen. So we had very high waves. I've heard, in excess of 8 feet. In some areas, when you get on the lakes, it's way in excess of that. But would you say we had some pretty bad weather that you were forecasting? It was coming into the area. So Enbridge and others knew bad weather was coming in. Is that accurate?
Yes, I know the Weather Service has provided what was being released for the wind observations and forecasts, as well as the wave forecast for that period of time that you're talking about. And when you look at the Straits of Mackinac, the material that was provided to you and your staff, sir, there were wave peaks in the order of 5 to 6 feet for significant wave height during that time frame. It was 5 p.m. on April the 15th was the maximum in the Straits. Significant wave height is the mean, the average of the highest 1/3 of waves. So that doesn't mean that was the maximum, but there were waves that were in that highest 1/3 that were 5 to 6 feet on
right.
On
and so the
15th.
Maximum though was in excess of that. We knew it's in excess. Right. That's a mean average. So we've got waves. Yeah. It's reasonable to say over 8 feet we're coming in. This is a bad weather condition coming in. And I knew this was happening at the time. After the strike, we were very concerned about whether or not there's been a response coming. In fact, Admiral Newman, this is where I thank you for bringing your folks together to talk about what would happen now that we've got bad weather coming in. We don't have visual inspection of this pipeline. We have Enbridge saying that their testing is looking good. We have PHMSA reviewing that, but still relying on what Enbridge has to say. But we don't have eyes on what that may be. And I asked you a question, or your team a question at that time, that you have skimmers on site because you're cleaning up the cable break. At what size, or how effective are they in rough seas and wave heights? And I was told at the time anything beyond 2 to 3 feet, they would be ineffective. Is that accurate?
Chairman, I do recall that we provided that information to you. I think typically in the Unified Command we would use 2 meters, which is about 6.5 feet as a standard, but really any significant wave height, it does make it more challenging to contain a spill. It does make it more difficult, and you have to look at all of your options.
Yeah, and I know you, Admiral, you cared so deeply about the Great Lakes in response. When you say it's more challenging, I mean, yes. You can't get out there to clean in rough seas, and when you have those kinds of winds, the kinds of projections as to what would happen to oil, the worst case projections come to bear as well. That'll blow that stuff, and the currents will be strong to move it around, and we can't simply get equipment out there. So it is a very frightening situation. It's going to put our responders in as you say, an incredibly challenging position. But I would argue at that point we're looking at catastrophic damage now that will have irreparable harm, especially during that kind of storm environment. Minister Elliott, I spoke to you during that, and I will talk to our representative from Enbridge later. But there's an agreement with the state of Michigan that they would shut down the pipeline if there's 8 feet of swells because of the issue related to cleanup. We've heard from NOAA that weather forecasts were basically telling us that, and it actually came to pass that we had that kind of weather. It was on front page papers about the big storm that came across here. So the state requirement was 8 feet, but we had to really put some pressure on Enbridge, and I appreciate you taking my call and spending time over a weekend that you were engaged. But Enbridge, it was not without some effort to get them to shut that down. Is that correct?
Well, Senator, yeah, and first of all, weekends don't matter when we're talking about issues such as safety. You're correct. I mean, the agreement that Enbridge has talks about 8-foot high waves, and in this case, we knew we were dealing with some concerns about the lines that ran on the Straits of Mackinac. It was our hopes that Enbridge would have ceased operations when I think it was about 2 weeks after the anchor strike that we were talking.
Right.
And in this case, you and I talked, and I also had conversation with some of the leadership at Enbridge. So it took a discussion to get them to shut down the line until the storm had passed, yes.
The question I have for Admiral Noonan, that I understand that the Coast Guard now is proposing dealing with the navigation area and specifically about anchors. You want to tell me more about your efforts to have regulations to prevent anchoring in that area?
Yes, Chairman. After this incident, the state of Michigan actually put in place a temporary regulated navigational area, and the Coast Guard has proposed such. It is out for public comment until September 4th, and then subsequent to that, we will initiate a regulated navigation area. If you look on the chart right now, it does warn of undersea cables, and it doesn't say don't anchor here, but we think that this additional RNA, is what we call it, will definitely sort of raise the awareness of the concerns in that area and also provide some consequences if someone intentionally or unintentionally anchors in that area.
So you're significantly increasing both civil penalties and potentially criminal penalties for doing that?
Yes, sir.
Well, that's good. I appreciate that. We definitely need to continue to move forward on that. Mr. Elliott, PHMSA recently authorized Enbridge to return to maximum operating pressure after a composite sleeve was utilized to reinforce the areas of the pipe that had been affected by this anchor strike. At a top level, can you explain why the lower pressure had been mandated following that strike?
Yes, Senator, and if I can take just a second to explain. So the maximum allowable pressure for the section of pipeline that traverses the Straits of Mackinac is 600 psi. Enbridge historically has operated at a pressure much lower than that, between 150 and 200 psi. When the dents occurred, we worked with Enbridge to understand their corrective action plan to resolve the dents. They followed through on that commitment. Our engineering staff went through all the repair criteria. And then after the repairs were made and the sleeves were put on the outside of the dent area, and at that point we felt that it was appropriate to go ahead and reestablish the original maximum allowable operating pressure. But please let me stress that in 2017, that line was also pressure tested hydrostatically to 1200 psi. So the maximum allowable pressure is 1 point, but again, we know that Enbridge in this case typically operates that pipeline at a much lower rate, between 150 and 200 psi. So given the repairs that were made, given the inline inspection technology that had been applied both before and then after the repairs were made, and we're still going to be reviewing some of the additional inline inspection that's been done after the repair, we felt it was adequate to go ahead and allow the operating pressure to return.
But I get back to the damage that was done. My understanding is once we got a visual inspection of both of the ROVs plus putting divers into the water, that there was not just denting. We keep talking about denting, but there was also gouging, is how that occurred on the pipes. Can you describe the difference between denting and gouging, and specifically why gouging is more of a concern for PHMSA than denting? And we've got to be clear, right. These pipes were gouged.
Well, and certainly, and actually, I think the best way to really explain it is there's three terms I like to use. So a dent is what we would normally see if someone were to take a ball-peen hammer and hit a piece of soft metal. There's an indentation. There's a second term that we use called scoring, and that's actually where if you think about maybe a warm knife through a pad of butter where actually there's deformation of the material, but there's no removal of the base metal in this case. And then the third point that you bring about is gouging. That's where you would apply, the example I use would be like a wood chisel that actually has constant downward force in the metal that's removed. In this case, there was indications, not only was there a dent, but some gouging. Now, to your very good point, where we get concerned about gouging is because that's where we have a more likelihood of a crack, and a crack that's allowed to propagate. So that was one thing that we were looking at closely. But I might also add, with some of the inline inspection work, that data that we reviewed, that's one of the items that this inline inspection data can help us identify. But you're correct. I mean, gouging does create more of a concern for us.
So are you, is PHMSA confident that the coating is fully intact on the straight segment of line 5, all of the coating?
Well, we know for sure that there are, and the term that we use in the business are coating holidays. There's actually some areas where coating has been removed from the pipe. We know that, and it goes along with some of the spacing gaps that occur. The spacing requirements are actually part of Enbridge's permit to operate with the state. We know, too, in working with Enbridge, that they have a plan not only to put in more anchors than they have done already to help stabilize the pipeline, but they also have a plan to go and catalog and then do work on recoding those coating holidays as well.
And how long will that take?
I'm not sure of the exact date, but I can get that and make sure that
we need to do that because obviously it has to be done quickly.
Yes, sir.
Given Enbridge has failed to report damage to Line 5 in the past, and so many folks in the audience will know many times where that hasn't happened, or we learn about it months later, or in some cases years later, how can PHMSA or the state of Michigan, for that matter, be confident that damages are actually being properly monitored and corrected given the track record that we have seen from Enbridge? Mr. Elliott.
Well, Senator, we are dependent upon not only Enbridge, but every operator in a 2.7 million pipeline network that we have in this country with hundreds of operators. We are dependent upon the operators to promptly report incidents that occur to their pipeline. We have a number of enforcement tools at our capability to help encourage those that do not report as they're required to do.
So is there any way, I mean, operationally, that the state or PHMSA can actually maintain, given the resource constraints that you have, are there any way that you can maintain independent eyes on an operation, or is that just an unrealistic expectation that we may have?
Well, Senator, I think it's fair to say, again, it's an expansive pipeline network in this country, but the men and women of PHMSA do the very best they can. We're dependent on integrity management systems that the pipeline operators are required to put in place. We also monitor their safety management systems. So there are a number of procedures and processes that we monitor. Is it fair to say that we can look at every mile of pipeline, every bit of data? No, that's not something we can do. We tend, though, to focus a lot of our time on those operators that we have the most concerns about.
Well, obviously some areas are more sensitive than others. You can't watch everything all of the time, but I think it's fair to say that you will not find a more sensitive area anywhere in the United States of America than the Straits of Mackinac. So the question is, how can we operationally keep independent eyes in one place or a few that are absolutely critical in so many ways?
Well, Senator, you have my commitment that we will work hard every day to ensure the integrity of the entire Lakehead system in Line 5. The men and women of PHMSA do a great job each and every day with the resources we have to make sure that not every operator works in a safe manner. We have responsibilities through all of the United States, and I agree with you. This is a wonderfully pristine area and someplace that we have to make sure that we work very hard to ensure the safety operations and the integrity of the operator.
Well, I appreciate that commitment, but we need to work on a variety of areas to make sure that commitment becomes real. As you know, I was able to get language recently passed that takes a look at the entire Great Lakes region and now classifies the entire Great Lakes region as a high consequence area, as catastrophic as it would be in the Straits of Mackinac. Anywhere in the Great Lakes region is a risk to the Great Lakes, all across the Upper Peninsula, very sensitive areas. We've got to treat all of that as a special place with unique challenges. That's in the law. Where are we in actually implementing that?
So we've had our first meeting here in Michigan to help understand the complexities of identifying some of the terms that came into play. There are some definitions that had heretofore been part of definitions of high consequence areas. The team has come back from that first session. We have started to work on some language for an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. And I think, too, in talking to my staff, we're looking to come back here in the near future to kind of run that information by folks here in the state, and then we'll move more quickly forward with the rulemaking.
Can I get your commitment you will make that a priority within your agency?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Lundgren, part of why the Great Lakes region is so sensitive is the fact that it's fresh water as opposed to salt water. I mentioned in my opening comments my concern is that we know a whole lot more about cleaning up oil in salt water, and primarily as a result of the fact that there are microorganisms that exist in salt water that simply don't exist in fresh water that make it more complicated. Could you inform the committee on the science of cleanup of fresh water versus salt water and why fresh water is so much more difficult to clean?
Yeah, certainly, Senator. You're correct that historically most research has been focused on marine environments over time, partly reflecting historic transport patterns as well as the substantial spills that have driven major research booms in the oil spill world. Exxon Valdez in 1989, Deepwater Horizon in 2010. So much of the knowledge that is there relates to that. There was a recent survey of over 11,000 spill research publications spanning 30 years, and it did find that about 5% were focused on freshwater, less than 5%. So there is interest in expanding freshwater research driven by the shift in inland oil production and transport, as well as the Kalamazoo River spill, but it does remain a small fraction. Some of the types of biological degradation that you're talking about that ultimately does consume a lot of oil, there's additional knowledge that could be warranted and could be developed through further research. While many response tactics and much of the response knowledge on injury has been developed from saltwater spills, and a lot of that may be directly transferable or adaptable to fresh, research is certainly prudent to ensure a lot of the deeper understanding that you mentioned of the changes resulting from the water density, salinity, the major ecosystem differences, including the microorganisms that are major degraders. So that plus the additional concern for drinking water resources warrants greater understanding, and that's certainly an area of interest for us.
Well, we certainly need to have much greater understanding across the country because these pipelines are crossing rivers and other lakes. It is important for us to have a sense of how to deal with that, which is a big reason why in the Coast Guard reauthorization bill I've included language to create a center of excellence to be able to research freshwater spills to the extent that they need to be, because we've fallen behind in that, and how we clean up these spills, coordinate with the Coast Guard. Admiral Noonan, that'll be within the Coast Guard reauthorization when passed, and we're hoping to bring partners with the universities here in Michigan, the Coast Guard, other entities to be able to increase that research effort. I know you do some of that research currently and do it in other facilities along the East Coast. But we're hoping to work closely with you and find the appropriate funding and other mechanisms to make that a reality. How would you see that playing out?
In an unrestrained budget, we would always want more research, more development, and it was great to have some of your staff come on board, the Coast Guard Cutter Hollyhock, when we are continuing to do some of the research that's happening within the Coast Guard's R&D Center and with our partners. But I think the point that you bring up about resources is something that we can't ignore, and really has to do with how do we prioritize our resources. So right now I'm committed to continuing to do everything that we can do to further that advancements in technology and using what we have.
Well, in wrapping up this panel, I mean, one thing that to me is very clear. We've been talking about oil response for an unthinkable act. But bottom line, we don't ever want to get to the point where we have to clean up. It's, we want to... And we know accidents occur, and just by the presence of whatever that pipeline exists, there's always the possibility. We see it in places all across the country at various times. Accidents do happen. So my question for you, Administrator Elliott, has PHMSA ever ordered the decommissioning and removal of an oil pipeline in the United States of America?
Yeah.
We have not.
You have not done that in the past. Is there a procedure or a process that could lead to the decommissioning of an oil pipeline?
As I had mentioned earlier, Senator, we have emergency authority powers, though we've not executed those. They have been recently given to PHMSA within the last few years. We typically find that working through corrective action orders or other processes we have, that we can work to get pipeline operators to quickly comply in resolving any safety issues. I do think it's fair to say, though, that if we do find a situation that is severe and critical enough, that we would not hesitate to use that ability to force a pipeline operator to cease operations. I might say on the opposite end, there's a fair amount of new pipeline construction, as you know, going on in this country. We have a pretty good record of not allowing pipelines to start up operation until we've been absolutely sure that they could attest to the full integrity of their operations.
So those are today's regulations. Of course, the pipe across the Straits, it was 60 years ago. The world was a lot different then. So I appreciate the testimony from all three of you. As I mentioned in the opening, we're going to keep the record open. I'm sorry I couldn't ask all the questions I would like to ask in the time that we have, but we will submit additional questions for the record to get your response. I open that up to anybody who would like to have questions or comments put into the official Senate record regarding the testimony that you have heard from these three witnesses. We're going to now end this panel. We're going to bring up a second panel to further discuss this issue. But again, thank you for your testimony. Thank you for taking the effort to be here. I look forward to working closely with all three of you. Thank you so much. Well, we now have our second panel situated, and I want to thank each of our panelists for being here today to provide your testimony. Our panel today consists of Mr. David Bryson, who is the Senior Vice President for Operations, Liquid Pipelines for Enbridge out of Calgary, Alberta. Sir, Mr. Bryson, certainly I'm pleased that you're here today. I think you've already heard from some of the reaction from the folks in the audience today. This is an issue of great concern to Michiganders, as well as it should be a great concern for everybody in the country, given the importance of the Great Lakes, not just for the region, but for the entire nation. And my goal for this hearing is to give Enbridge an opportunity to articulate your vision of safety and environmental protection for folks to hear. I have not always agreed with the company's approach, and believe that as a result of the disaster in Kalamazoo, there is a significant deficit of trust when it comes to Enbridge and dealing with the people of Michigan. But having said that, I'm grateful for your willingness to be here, and we all look forward to hearing your testimony. We have also Dr. Schreiberg, who is the Executive Director of the National Wildlife Federation's Great Lakes Regional Center in Ann Arbor. Dr. Schreiberg, thank you for your leadership within the National Wildlife Federation, as well as your service to the state on the Pipeline Safety Advisory Board. You have been a tremendous advocate for the Great Lakes, and having you here testify is most appreciated. Mr. Hennessy, Mr. Chris Hennessy, is another witness who is the business development representative from the Michigan Laborers, Employers Cooperation and Education Trust. Mr. Hennessy, as you know, for nearly a century, Michigan laborers have been building the infrastructure that Michiganders rely on every day, and your workers, quite frankly, have built most of Michigan. So we appreciate that, and we appreciate your testimony on workforce related to pipelines. We also have with us Mr. Larry Bell, who is the founder and owner of Bell's Brewery in Kalamazoo, Michigan. As is obvious, Mr. Bell has been a tremendous advocate for the Great Lakes. In fact, I certainly enjoyed being present when you were honored by the League of Conservation Voters for your very forceful advocacy on behalf of the environment, and in particular clean water. There's no question we can't enjoy your great product without having clean water. And actually that's something that I really fully appreciate and love to have you here. We also have Mr. David Merck, who is the manager of Pipelines, Midstream, and Industry Operations, the American Petroleum Institute. Mr. Merck, thank you for being here today and sharing the American Petroleum Institute's expertise, as well as for your past service to the United States Coast Guard. As you heard when I introduced Admiral Noonan, the people of Michigan appreciate the men and women who serve in the Coast Guard, and your service in the Coast Guard was certainly exemplary, and we look forward to learning more from you. I know I had a lot of questions for the previous panel, so we're going to try and move this one a little quicker, although you still obviously will all have hopefully your less than 5-minute opening comments, and then we will get to some questions for this panel. So with that, Mr. Bryson, if you would lead off this panel. I'm sorry the table looks a little short for the 5 of you here, but we appreciate you being here, Mr. Bryson. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Senator Peters. My name is David Bryson. I oversee liquid pipeline operations for Enbridge throughout North America. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss pipeline safety and emergency response as it relates to the Great Lakes. An important focus for this committee, for the people and businesses of Michigan and Great Lakes region, and a critical priority for Enbridge. Enbridge brings to this morning's discussion our experience as an operator of critical energy infrastructure in Michigan and the Great Lakes region for more than 60 years. Today, our company is one of the largest suppliers of energy across the state. Line 5 is one of several pipelines we operate in Michigan. The pipeline carries light and synthetic and crude and natural gas liquids. Line 5 carries to market Michigan-produced light crude oil, helps supply refineries in the greater Detroit area, and helps meet approximately 55% of Michigan's statewide propane demand. Line 5 has also been receiving a lot of attention lately, not for the products and benefits it provides to Michigan and the surrounding region, but for the unique environment in which it operates, specifically the Straits of Mackinac. At Enbridge, we understand how important the Great Lakes and the Straits are to the Michigan residents and businesses. The health and protection of these waterways are essential to the vitality, sustainability, and economic prosperity of the region and the state of Michigan overall. We also recognize that our unique responsibility to Michigan is born out of a shared experience, a failure 8 years ago on an Enbridge pipeline in Marshall, Michigan, that fundamentally reshaped our company's approach to managing risk and pipeline integrity, and that has defined a safety culture at Enbridge fixated on 100% safe operations and zero incidents. Prevention is a key component of safety. Enbridge's integrity management and monitoring programs for Line 5 at the Straits crossing are as unique as the surrounding areas and rely on federal and state regulations as a baseline for our actions as we strive for continuous improvement. Our proactive inspection program allows us to monitor the fitness of our pipelines using advanced technologies from both inside the pipeline and outside the pipeline. While prevention is a critical component of our pipeline safety and our first priority, in the unlikely event of an incident, Enbridge is committed to providing a comprehensive incident response at any point along our pipeline network. Enbridge maintains strong emergency preparedness and response systems, and we regularly test and continually improve through simulated exercises and drills alongside federal, state, local first responders and emergency management officials. This includes the training, people, and resources to respond to incidents in any conditions, including winter. Enbridge has its significant supplies of equipment and resources stationed near the Straits. These resources, including support from oil spill removal organizations, can be moved and concentrated at any point along Line 5 to enable a safe, efficient, and effective response. We recently strengthened our emergency response capability at the Straits by purchasing $7 million in additional equipment, which enhances our capabilities and further reduces the response time in the unlikely event of an incident. In addition, as you heard from Rear Admiral Noonan, the U.S. Coast Guard, which has federal jurisdiction in this area, would augment any response. In summary, Enbridge has been operating liquids and natural gas pipelines in Michigan for more than 60 years. And today, our company is one of the largest suppliers of energy across the state and the Great Lakes region. Within this system, Line 5 has been and will continue to be a critical link in the Straits, connecting Michigan's two peninsulas to safely and reliably deliver the energy Michigan families and businesses rely on each day. While we are committed to helping further secure Michigan's energy future, and we see Line 5 as an integral part of that future, Enbridge also recognizes that the Straits of Mackinac is a special place, vital to the Michigan residents and to the state's economy. Our multi-layered pipeline safety management system continues to protect Line 5 in the Straits, and our use of advanced technologies continues to drive the risk lower and lower. We are committed to harnessing and developing new technologies to further protect and enhance the integrity of our assets and to ensuring a timely and coordinated, robust response to protect the Great Lakes. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of today's discussion, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bryson. Dr. Sherburne?
Yes. Thank you, Senator Peters, for your leadership and for inviting me to this critical hearing. My name is Mike Schreiberg, and I'm the Great Lakes Regional Executive Director of the National Wildlife Federation. I'm also a member of the Michigan Pipeline Safety Advisory Board. Sorry, a little closer? Better? Yep. Although I'm not speaking in that capacity today. My focus today in summarizing my full submitted testimony is to outline how Enbridge Energy's Line 5 in the Straits has exposed serious flaws in both our state and federal regulatory regimes. Fortunately, there are solutions for both our Great Lakes and our oversight of pipelines across the country. For Line 5, the most important context is that Michigan and the Great Lakes serve mainly as a shortcut for mostly Canadian oil and natural gas liquids to go to mostly Canadian export markets. In fact, new independent research, which has been submitted for the record, reveals that the small value provided by Line 5 to the state of Michigan could be replaced without noticeable impact to consumers. Of course, there is no substitute for the Great Lakes and our way of life. For this oral testimony, my focus will not be on the strong case for the state to take immediate action to begin decommissioning Line 5, but rather on this committee's interest in improvements to our federal regulatory regime as revealed through the lessons learned about Line 5. Lesson 1, the need for increased transparency. The current system fails to appreciate that transparency is vital to safety and national security. For example, Enbridge revealed just 2 weeks ago at the Michigan Pipeline Safety Advisory Board that it placed a sleeve on the damaged section of the pipelines from an April 1 boat anchor strike, and that the maximum operating pressure restriction from the incident has been lifted, as we heard. However, when asked for the underwater video and images, as well as for the official documentation, the answer at that board meeting was that the approval was done orally, and that the videos and images were never turned over to the state or PHMSA, and that Enbridge would not release them. How can Congress, the states, and citizens trust that decision-making will truly protect the Great Lakes when it cannot read the agency's decision or view the records of inspection? The solution is to greatly strengthen disclosure provisions. Lesson 2. We need to close the loophole that leaves certain freshwater ecosystems with less protection. Our state learned this lesson all too painfully in the wake of Enbridge Energy's oil spill disaster near the Kalamazoo River. There can and should be specific emergency spill response plans in place that protect our freshwater ecosystems. Where these plans are not feasible, pipelines should not be allowed to operate. The Straits of Mackinac are the extreme example of this case. Moreover, PHMSA has not yet, to my knowledge, and as we heard earlier, used its statutory authority to declare the Great Lakes an unusually sensitive area under the Pipes Act. Beyond the Great Lakes and the Straits, protections need to be in place for all waterways, which means PHMSA would need to implement its statutory authority for freshwater fully. Third lesson, we need clear leadership and authority. The violation of the state easement, in part due to the excessive length of unsupported spans and structural deficiencies, and the implementation of the agreement between Governor Snyder and Enbridge Energy, all exposed unclear lines of authority and leadership. Moreover, in the wake of the anchor strike, PHMSA reportedly said that it lacked the authority to issue a temporary shutdown. I appreciate you asking questions about that earlier. And the state never implemented its own authority under the easement or under the Snyder-Enbridge deal. Clearly, we need to clarify authority and leadership. Fourth and final lesson, we need to require end-of-life and public benefit assessments. The Straits section of Line 5 was built for a 50-year life, yet is now in its 65th year with no assessment of end-of-life. In recent months and years, we have learned about major problems, each of which have been discovered not by PHMSA, but essentially by accident. As you heard earlier, this is because the agency lacks the authority and jurisdiction to make assessments about when a pipeline is beyond its useful life and poses a great risk to the public. That's the situation we're in with Line 5 in the Straits. The National Wildlife Federation stands ready to work with Congress and the agencies to carefully address this problem on Line 5 and across the country. In conclusion, thank you for allowing me to summarize my testimony and for taking the time to hold this field hearing. We have the ability and responsibility to not only protect the Great Lakes and our way of life from the threat that Line 5 poses, but to also utilize Michigan's experiences with Line 5 to better protect our natural, cultural, and economic resources throughout this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schreiberg. Mr. Hennessy.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing, specifically regarding the role the members of the Laborers International Union of North America, our training program, plays in the construction and maintenance of pipelines here in Michigan, and the economic significance it has to the workers that we represent. As the Senator mentioned, we have a long history of building the state, from downtowns to schools to our water, sewer, and energy infrastructure systems. The Michigan Laborers Training and Apprenticeship Institute was founded in 1972 and is the training arm of LIUNA and our signatory contractors. We have 4 locations in Michigan: Wayne, Perry, St. Joseph, and Iron Mountain. Our training center has built a reputation as one of the safest and most productive facilities in the nation, with more American National Standards Institute certified instructors than any similar facility. We've certified nearly 700 members in pipeline construction, safety, and technology since the U.S. Department of Transportation's operator qualification rule went into effect. LIUNA members are involved in both the production and transmission of our nation's energy resources. We repair and build sites, and we strengthen and repair service roads to those sites. We build both transmission and mainline pipelines and distribution lines that get them to homes and businesses. We also build processing and compression stations. But most important, as LIUNA members, we maintain this energy infrastructure under the highest standards designed to protect both workers and surrounding communities. Before members begin working on a pipeline, such as Line 5, they're required to take the pipeline technology class at the training center. This class is a comprehensive 80 hours of instruction over 2 weeks, where students learn methods to prepare pipe surface, with proper coatings to ensure no imperfections and to prevent incidents such as leaks. Students learn these skills through instructor-led interactive discussions, demonstrations, as well as hands-on practice that simulates the type of work encountered during the construction or repair of a pipeline. At the end of this course, workers are put through performance evaluations for every task performed in the field. This is a requirement of the DOT's Operator Qualification Program. It's important to note that the graduates and our contractors gain a clear understanding of the environmental responsibilities of the pipeline worker. They learn erosion control, species stewardship, water protection. It's fair to say that this type of environmental training, along with worker and public safety, are the most important aspects of our training program. In the last 10 years, LIUNA members in Michigan have logged more than 8.1 million work hours on pipeline construction and maintenance, continuing to make them safe so many of the people could come to this hearing today. These work hours equate to more than $202 million in wages paid to Michigan residents, from Iron Mountain in the Upper Peninsula to Monroe on Lake Erie. Not only has this work helped local communities across the state, it's ensured families receive excellent privately funded health care. These work hours represent more than $43 million in health care for children, mothers, fathers, and grandparents. Simply put, we look at the construction and maintenance of pipelines as a lifeline to good family-supporting jobs. LIUNA members were involved in the original construction of Line 5, and we took this responsibility seriously. Our members and signatory contractors feel strongly about Michigan and its health. They work every day to make sure pipeline operations are safe for their friends, family, and neighbors. We ask this committee to do its due diligence with respect to oversight of this important piece of the nation's energy infrastructure work. Specifically, we want the committee to ensure that the people of Michigan continue to receive a reliable supply of energy to heat their homes, cook dinners for their families, and provide transportation needed to get them to places of necessity. We also ask that the committee require the continued inspection of Line 5 and other pipelines in Michigan using evidence-based research when making decisions about changes to existing methods of transporting energy. Again, thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing and provide this committee with information about our role in construction and continuing to provide reliable sources of energy to people in Michigan. We're happy to answer any questions the committee may have at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hennessy. Mr. Bell.
Thank you, Senator. Great honor to be here today representing Bell's Brewery, and also I'm here as a founding member of the Great Lakes Business Network, which represents over 70 businesses, a network that was formed for the express purpose of shutting down Line 5 because the business owners feel that it's an undue liability risk to their businesses. Senator, as a brewer of high-quality beers, the integrity of ingredients to us is of utmost importance at Bell's, and we strive to purchase the best grains and hops for our products, and we've heavily invested in our laboratory to culture pure yeast for our fermentations. But our number one ingredient, water, and its purity is not a thing that we can always control the quality of. Hence, maintaining pure water in the state of Michigan has become of paramount importance to our company and to most of the breweries of this state. Our brewery in Escanaba, Michigan, the Upper Hand Brewery, uses water from the municipal system of the city, which is sourced from Lake Michigan. And while Escanaba is a considerable distance from the Straits and from Enbridge's Line 5 in the Straits, a pipeline failure, given certain conditions, could make it to Escanaba, but it would also be highly publicized that the perception of us making beer with contaminated water would be a harm to our sales. We believe this right now because we are currently dealing with this issue due to PFAS contamination issues in the vicinity of our main brewery in Comstock, Michigan. While water from the Kalamazoo municipal system remains clean, our customers both in-state and out-of-state have been concerned because of the contamination of water in Parchment, Michigan, which abuts Kalamazoo. Due to the spate of PFAS issues around the state, as well as the issue with lead in the water in Flint, Michigan, our state has been gaining a reputation for having bad water. This is not the kind of thing that makes us comfortable in the brewing business. A rupture of Line 5 and the resulting contamination of Lakes Michigan and Huron would be top news around the world. The debate about Line 5 has quickly become one of the hottest topics in this year's statewide races for political office. The media coverage of a rupture of Line 5 and the resulting devastation to wildlife and municipal water systems in the vicinity of the rupture would be leading stories for most news outlets. A rupture of Line 5 would cement Michigan's reputation of having the worst water in the United States. This reputation would have horrible effects upon our business as brewers. Recently, at the annual meeting of the Michigan Brewers Guild, the Guild voted overwhelmingly, 83-2, to call for the shutdown of Line 5. A rupture of Line 5 would also hurt our business because of the great loss in tourism that the Straits area currently enjoys. The Straits area, Mackinac Island, and northern Michigan have long been recognized for their beauty and attract a plethora of visitors and seasonal residents every year. This cohort of people are an important customer base for our business. A rupture of Line 5 has the possibility of corrupting the water supplies for many communities in northern Michigan. Should this happen, it is highly likely that property values would plummet and great amounts of tourism would be lost in the area, and that would result in a loss of business, not just for Bell's, but for thousands of businesses in our state. It has been well documented that Line 5 has experienced stress and damage that it was never intended to endure. A recent strike by a boat anchor has put dents in the pipeline. Underwater video evidence shows bends in the pipeline, as well as the deterioration of the pipeline's protective coating. Also documented is the fact that the pipeline has not been properly anchored to the lake floor, further stressing the pipeline. We should also question the ability of Enbridge to shut the pipeline down timely in the event of emergency. It is well known that when a spill was occurring in Marshall, Michigan, that operators in Enbridge ignored multiple warnings for 17 hours and in turn upped the pressure in the line twice, resulting in the biggest inland oil spill in the history of the United States. This type of laissez-faire attitude cannot be tolerated. Line 5 was originally intended to be in service for 50 years. It is now 65 years old. Nothing lasts forever, and every day that goes by increases the chance of a devastating rupture and spill of oil into the Straits. The possibility of a rupture in Line 5 and the oil spill that would result from such a rupture in the Straits of Mackinac is a risk that is simply too much to ask for those that count on clean water in the Great Lakes for drinking, for business, and for recreation. It is not in the interest of the residents of Michigan to continue to allow this pipeline to operate, and it would be best if this pipeline were shut down. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bell. Mr. Merck.
Hey, good morning, Senator Peters. I'm David Merck. I'm the pipeline manager for the American Petroleum Institute. And I want to thank you as well for the opportunity to appear before you today. Safety for our industry is a core value. Our proactive prevention, preparedness, and response efforts help protect the public and the environment, including the Great Lakes, and help ensure the safe transportation of energy that American families and businesses need and demand every day. At API, I'm responsible for oil and natural gas pipeline safety policy. Previously, as you pointed out, I served 26 years overseeing safety in the public sector, including 24 years with the U.S. Coast Guard and 2 years at the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration as the Director of Field Operations for Pipeline Safety. I've committed my entire life to public safety and environmental protection and continue to do so working with pipeline operators to promote safety in all operations. Pipelines play a critical role in delivering energy to Michigan families and businesses. There are nearly 9,000 miles of natural gas transmission lines and close to 3,500 miles of petroleum pipelines in the state. Energy infrastructure contributes to local communities across the Great Lakes states, supporting over 14,000 jobs and providing nearly $1 billion in labor income in 2015. Michigan also leads the nation in propane consumption for home heating in the residential sector, where 1 in 10 residents use propane, kerosene, or fuel oil to warm their homes. Michigan was also in the top 15 as a national consumer of distillate fuel oil, natural gas liquids, and motor gasoline in 2016 to support recreation, transportation, and agriculture. As we move these critical energy resources in Michigan and throughout the United States by pipeline, the protection of the public and the environment is a top priority, and we continually strive to reach a goal of 0 incidents. This requires the right combination of prevention, mitigation, and response strategies that are most appropriate for a company's unique assets in the environment they operate. Our Liquids Pipeline Safety Excellence Initiative with the Association of Oil Pipelines and our 3-year strategic plan seeks to enhance organizational safety culture and technological innovation, which includes the implementation of pipeline safety management systems and efforts to examine, share, and learn from ongoing operations and past incidents. This embodies the work of nearly a dozen industry-wide pipeline groups to improve pipeline operations and safety. As a high-tech industry, we continue to focus on research and development. Improvements to leak detection and pipeline integrity inspection are strategic objectives that drive our industry to invest in furthering inline inspection technology, or smart pigs, to identify defects like corrosion dents or cracks and provide operators information for preventative maintenance and decisions on priority repairs. Also, API partners with the best and brightest technical experts from the government, academia, and industry to create industry standards and recommended practices that go beyond regulations to ensure the highest level of safety. Our standards program is accredited by the American National Standards Institute, the same organization that accredits similar programs at several national laboratories. In fact, we have over 30 standards specific to pipeline safety, including recommended practices related to safety management systems, pipeline integrity, pipeline leak detection management, emergency response, and managing hydrotechnical hazards for pipeline water crossings. Our primary goal is preventing incidents before they occur. However, pipelines are also ready to respond in partnership with first responders and government authorities. As a former federal on-scene coordinator for the Coast Guard for spill response, I know firsthand the importance of a community being prepared to respond to an incident into pristine waterways such as the Great Lakes. That said, with area contingency plans and pipeline response plans as a foundation, we proactively conduct drills and exercises and review how the operator effectively collaborates and executes a response in specific environments, including ice. Pipeline operators are also working with first responders and government agencies on the implementation of Recommended Practice 1174, which provides a pipeline-specific framework for continued improvement of emergency planning and response. API recently hosted 2 webinars to educate first responders, industry, and government agencies on the importance and implementation of the RP. API also helped create a free online pipeline emergency response training program of the National Association of State Fire Marshals. To date, nearly 8,100 first responders have completed training, including 152 from Michigan. We are committed to promoting safety in all operations and helping to ensure American families and businesses in Michigan and across the country can safely and efficiently access affordable and reliable energy. I want to thank you again, Senator, for the opportunity to appear before you today, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Merck, and again, thank you to all of our witnesses for all of your perspective on this issue. I want to start the questioning the same place I started the questioning with our federal officials, and that was the April blizzard that we had after the anchor strike on the pipes, which we've learned didn't just dent them, actually gouged them as well, which creates another set of concerns in operating a pipe. And Mr. Bryson, in your written testimony, you talk about some of the recent changes to the agreement with the state of Michigan, and you quote here, you agreed as part of the November 17th agreement that the state of Michigan, with the state of Michigan, to voluntarily shut down the dual pipelines during periods of sustained adverse weather conditions where wave heights exceed 8 feet at the Straits crossing. And that's why I want to start with this, because as I mentioned in some of my opening comments and through some of the questions, we have a situation with your company that there is just a lack of trust with a lot of folks in Michigan. It starts obviously with the Kalamazoo disaster, which was a horrible, catastrophic event. has continued with things as Dr. Schreberg has mentioned in terms of transparency. So there just is not trust that Enbridge will truly step up to what you claim in your testimony as looking out for the best interest of not just the waters around Michigan, but to safeguard your pipelines across the country. So you have this agreement for 8 feet. You heard earlier from the gentleman from NOAA, which is our National Weather Forecasting Agency, who was forecasting, and indeed happened, that we had waves in excess of 8 feet. It took quite a bit of effort on on my part, working with Administrator Elliott on it. So my question to you, does Enbridge have independent weather forecasting service, or would you look at the forecast of the NOAA National Weather Forecast, and how do you look at those weather reports, both as forecast as well as when they actually are occurring, when you look out the window and you can actually see it?
Okay, well, I think it's important. I just want to
Start
off by saying prior to the storm, we never hesitate to shut our systems down. As a matter of fact, we're involved in shutting our systems down on a regular basis for a variety of reasons. As soon as we became aware of the anchor strike from ATC, the pipeline was shut down. The pipeline was shut down. We performed leak detection analysis. We performed a pressure test, not a hydrostatic test, but a pressure hold test. We ran a gauge plate tool through both lines to determine that there wasn't any deformation in the pipelines. We then ran tools through high caliber tools to determine if there was a dent, what it looked like, and it did show us the dents. And it also showed us that the pipes had not moved, because we used GeoPig data to show us whether the pipes have moved or not. All those steps were taken prior to the storm coming that you're speaking about, which I'll get to in a second. So, and the pipe had been shut down for a day after the anchor strike to ensure that we were comfortable with that. Finite element analysis was done by our engineers to examine the burst pressure of the pipeline. A pressure reduction was taken of the pipeline, and that's why we had confidence that the structural integrity of the system was intact as we're focused on safe operations. So leading into the weekend, our people, as you heard earlier, were part of the Unified Command. So we were aware of the weather. NOAA was there, we were there, the Coast Guard was there. And we were very aware of the fact that there was a pending storm. Of course, it's regional, so it doesn't have the same impact everywhere. And we had people in incident command, and we had people on the ground witnessing the weather. And the storm was building, of course, but even into Saturday night, the waves forecasted in the Straits and actuals were 2 to 3 feet. Sunday morning, we did have an unrelated power event in Superior, and the lines were shut down. And it was at that time I was having a conversation on Sunday morning with Mr. Elliott, and the decision was made just to leave the lines down. I think the NOAA experts said that the waves had peaked on Sunday at 5 or 6 feet. The pipeline was shut down during that period. We started up sometime later on Monday, Senator.
So now you know that wasn't his testimony, that they peaked at 5 to 6. That's a mean average based on waves, and that they were clearly waves in excess of 8 feet or so. And I just go back to this chart. Red, I think, is bad. Red is bad, and they were there. That we know that there was going to be very severe weather coming in. And I guess my question is, and this is what's so frustrating for me as I went through that experience and getting Enbridge to recognize that, to shut it down, and then to say you had an unrelated event related to it, again with this deficit of trust, is that we've got weather forecasts saying that these are going to be large waves. Peaks will be in excess of 8 feet. The mean's going to be less, but the peaks will be in greater than that. You have actual agreement with the state of Michigan. You'd shut down over 8 feet. But this agreement is with a perfectly functioning, non-damaged pipe, if such a thing can exist. What you had in this situation was an anchor strike. And not only dents, as we also learned later, we got gouging, which is a whole lot worse than just strikes, according to the testimony. that we heard happening. And although your internal test showed that the integrity was there, we did not have any kind of visual inspection. In fact, it was the visual inspection that then showed it was gouging, not just dents, which is something of greater concern to everybody. We were going to have to wait 2.5 weeks, I'll get to that later, 2.5 weeks for actual visual inspection of an underwater vehicle. So we have weather forecasts coming in and the reality that you're going to have spikes of waves in excess of 8 feet, which means you should have, under state rules, shut it down. But here you are talking to the public saying you go the extra measure to make sure that you protect the Great Lakes, and yet you have a damaged pipe that we know is damaged on the bottom of the Straits. We don't know the full extent of it because we haven't put eyes on either with a submersible or divers. And later we find out there was the gouging, as I mentioned. And yet you push back on saying we will, in the spirit of making sure that we are really cautious when it comes to having an accident in the absolute worst place in the entire Great Lakes, we're still going to push back and say, no, you know, the waves are only, maybe they're 6 feet or something. We're not going to shut it down until we actually see it verified. I mean, can you see why that is something that people look at and say, Enbridge is not really focused on going the extra measure of safety when they had a damaged pipe in the Straits and a severe weather, and they pushed back on shutting down to make sure that nothing happened. So tell me why.
Well, Senator Peters, I wouldn't say we push back on shutting down. Like I said, we focus on the safety of our operation on a daily basis. We shut down our systems routinely for a variety of reasons. We had shut down this pipeline because of this. Multiple engineers were involved. Tool runs were performed. As we were heading into the weekend, we had people on the ground. We were involved in the Incident Command Center in consultation with the Coast Guard at NOAA around the wave height predictions. So the worst of the storm was we were speaking, I was physically speaking with our people through Friday night, through Saturday morning, through Sunday night. The worst of the storm did come on Sunday. We were shut down there. I would not characterize it as us pushing back about shutting down. When we need to shut our system down, we shut it down.
But then initially, when you shut it down, you said it was because of an operational problem somewhere else. It wasn't because of the storm. And you know, as you heard, I asked Admiral Noonan, the skimmers that were on the site there, with dealing with the break from the cables, they were ineffective in seas greater than 2 to 3 feet. So the equipment that's on site, ready to operate, would be ineffective at 2 to 3 feet. So forget the 8 feet. Whether or not you were violating the Michigan rule, you got the Michigan rule. You've got skimmers that we know, and so you say, well, the median was only 6 feet. That's still in excess of what these skimmers would actually be effective in. So without eyes on, without having visual inspection, without knowing for certain, with a damaged pipe, if anything happened to that pipe, it would have been impossible for that equipment to get out, as according to the testimony of the Coast Guard, with even those waves. So why would not the company say, we are going to show what stewards we are of the environment. We've got a damaged pipeline. We haven't had eyes on it. We know the waves are in excess of the skimmers that are on the site. We're going to shut this down to prove to the people of Michigan that we are responsible. That did not happen. Those are the facts of what happened, right?
We did shut down on Sunday, Senator, in the worst of the storm, and the peak came through Sunday night later, and we started up on Sunday. The important part, I think, is we had confidence that the system integrity was intact based on a lot of information.
So you had confidence based on the internal, and you had your engineers. Right. You still had not put eyes on. And as we heard from previous testimony, you never know for sure until you've actually taken a look at it. And we also found out there was gouging, which is a different kind of injury to it. So the question, as I asked the other panelists, why did it take over 2 weeks to actually get a submersible to take a look at that. That seems absolutely unacceptable that it takes 2 weeks to bring visual inspection. What happened? Why?
Well, we were again involved with the Unified Command. So part of that, part of the coordination effort of bringing the ROV to bear on the pipe was the coordination between the activity of the barge work over the electric lines and our facilities. So we were working to get an ROV over the pipe as quickly as we could within the Unified Command structure.
Now, I understand that it didn't even arrive on scene for a couple of weeks.
I could confirm the actual date, but we called for it soon. I think the important part to understand about our system, and as David said, the millions of pipeline miles across the country, you can't see the outside of the pipe because they're buried. So in today's technology, and part of the reason why our incident rates are decreasing, it's because of internally looking at the pipe, and that is the kind of work we do by sending these highly sophisticated tools on the inside of the pipe. The external analysis of the pipe from the ROV essentially just validated what we knew from the inside of the pipe.
So you know, I'm not an engineer, but I would think it's really hard for an anchor to hit a buried pipeline on the land. Is that correct?
It is, but...
so this is a completely different incident. You have a pipe here going along the bottom of the Straits that was hit by an anchor, which is the worst case scenario. That is where the outside damage occurs. You're not going to have that in a land buried pipeline going through. So this is a circumstance where you have to get eyes on, particularly given the sensitive nature of where you are operating.
Yeah, no, it's important.
And that needed to be. And to say that the Unified Command slowed it down, it was part of my questions with Admiral Noonan, is that if the Unified Command is just focused on the cable, then we've got to change Unified Command, and we've got to change Enbridge protocols that your priority is always line 5, always line 5. So now the question is, now that you've put the repairs forward and you've put in a coating, how confident are you that the coating on the Straits is fully intact without any additional missing segments?
There's some coating work going on right now. So we had a variety of work we were doing this year. We've installed anchors, we're doing a cathodic protection survey, and we're repairing the coating areas. So that is ongoing as we speak, Senator.
So the question that Dr. Schreberg answered, will you provide full documentation of the damage sustained to Line 5 by the anchor strike, including all video and images? Will you commit to doing that to the public?
Yes, I will. Yes.
You will?
Yes.
Well, that's great. Why haven't you not done that to this point?
Well, we've been involved with PHMSA, with the Coast Guard, Unified Command, because it was part of an active investigation. We've been gathering all of our information and trying to make sure that our line is safe. That's where our focus has been. And we believe that we've been providing the information as required.
Dr. Schreberg, that response, we want to comment on that and what else you think is necessary for the kind of transparency necessary to build the kind of trust necessary in the state?
Well, thank you, Senator. I think that's a good step, and you know that's part of the transparency. I think I would say it shouldn't take a hearing with the sitting U.S. Senator, although I appreciate you having this to get to the bottom. What I would like to see is that being a standard practice, not something that a special hearing would have to come to. But thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Mr. Bryson, another question, one that I've tried to get this answered, and it came up in testimony, I think, of Dr. Schreberg and others, and I can't seem to get the data. So I know that Enbridge has quoted data in terms of the amount of propane in the UP and other barrels of material that's being shipped to other parts in Michigan. But you've heard from a couple of our witnesses here that the perception among folks is that this is a pipeline that basically takes Canadian material and takes it to Canadian ports. We're just kind of the road along the way. Could you give us what percentage of material that goes through that pipeline actually stays in Michigan?
It would be around 30%. So part of the product that comes through ends up coming off the pipe at Rapid River, and then propane is extracted from that and distributed all around the region. That same thing happens in Superior, Wisconsin. A little longer farther down the pipeline at Lewiston, local Michigan production of oil is actually injected into the pipeline and then carries on with the pipeline. And then down closer into the Detroit area of networks, the light crude oil goes to the Marathon refinery in Detroit and other refineries in the region. It then carries across into Sarnia. Some of that crude ends up making its way across our Line 10 into New York, to the United Refinery in New York as well. So as David talked about, there is a complete network, obviously, of pipeline infrastructure.
So would you be willing to provide that information to us in written form as to how that's actually, because I have not been able to get that. I've asked about this.
Certainly can, Senator. We'll provide that as part of the testimony, yes.
I appreciate that.
Yep.
Mr. Schreberg, you've done some a recent report about concerns of propane in the Upper Peninsula. Certainly I hear about that when I'm in the Upper Peninsula. People are concerned about that. I know you've done a detailed study. Would you tell the committee about the findings of that study?
Sure. We contracted with London Economics International, a expert in this. And what they found, first of all, is the volume that is carried in natural gas liquids that are turned into propane in Rapid River. It's a fraction of a % of what's carried on the pipeline. So we'll start with that bit. It's about 30 million gallons a year. The good news about this for Michigan is there are easy substitutes for this. What London Economics International found is that if you take this same product and do either trucking or rail from Superior, Wisconsin to Rapid River, and that's where it's processed into propane, that's where the natural gas liquids go into propane, you can have that same service. And if there is any change in price, what our consultant says, it's lost in the noise of typical price volatility. So I think there's a myth out there that Line 5 is providing an essential energy infrastructure for the state. When you talk about propane in the UP, that's simply not true. There are plenty of substitutes there. And when you think about the risk, of course, and when you look at the risk to the Great Lakes and that small value that we have a substitute for, to me, it's an easy calculation.
Mr. Merck, if I could ask you a question regarding the kind of the differences between pipelines that are considered onshore and offshore. My understanding that the liability is different on those. Would you explain the differences, please?
The difference, I mean, that's a statutory difference, Senator Peters. As far as the differences, I'm not sure I clearly understand the question. I mean, there's liabilities that companies take on with any of their pipelines, whether it's crossing a body of water or on shore. So I'm not sure of the specific ask around that.
Well, the liability for an oil spill in offshore is dramatically greater than inshore. Mm-hmm. And that's for obvious reasons, that when it's offshore, the contamination, the way it spreads, the impact on the ecosystem, the impact on the economy can be dramatically different. And actually, that makes sense, but it also depends on how you classify. And unfortunately, the Line 5 through the Straits of Mackinac is classified as an inshore pipeline. Now, when I go to the Straits of Mackinac and I look across, that doesn't look inshore to me. And given the fact of the amount of water that goes through there, equal to 10 times that of Niagara Falls and east and west, we need to change that. That's why I've introduced legislation to make that pipeline an offshore pipeline so that the liability is there to make sure that that happens. Mr. Hennessy, you raised in your testimony that you obviously are a key part of making the infrastructure, and your union has been building infrastructure for a long time and are part of the oil pipeline infrastructure. But you also said in your testimony that you do believe that there needs to be evidence-based research. Could you tell me or elaborate on that you do support oversight as long as it's evidence-based, and how do you define that?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Senator. As my comments have stated, we work closely with both owners and construction contractors with respect to the original construction and maintenance, not specifically with operations. So one, I want to speak that I can't speak necessarily to the details or specifically to the operations of that pipeline. But with respect to the original construction, obviously laborers that were involved in this pipeline when it was originally built, it is still operating, so we're very proud of the role that we played specifically with that. Some of the research that we would like to be used both on the training aspect, working with our training centers, and how we're involved in the maintenance of these pipelines going forward. Secondly, with respect, when you had mentioned oversight, I do think it's the role of this committee and the federal government to provide oversight, as it's doing obviously today at this hearing. You're also there are additional witnesses that could have testified that also play a role within this. So we respect the committee's role in terms of oversight. So when you ask a question about evidence, we know both the company owners of pipelines are required to submit evidence to PHMSA as well as other agencies. We're required to submit our training requirements and work that we perform on pipelines to federal agencies. So we would ask that you take a holistic approach in looking at evidence both that is in law right now that is required from these owners as well as construction contractors on the original construction, but those that provide the maintenance as well, because that is where our role comes with respect to pipeline operations. Does that answer your question?
Yes, very good. Okay. Right. Appreciate it, Mr. Hennessy. Mr. Bell, you spoke from the perspective of businesses and as a successful business person here in Michigan. I want you to elaborate more on how the feelings of so many businesses in regards to this pipeline.
Well, Senator, I think certainly businesses up in this region of Michigan are more sensitive and aware of the pipeline of Line 5 and what could happen. But also, I think businesses in Kalamazoo and Marshall understand what kind of impact a disaster can have, as well as, I sponsor the #1 sailboat race in the state of Michigan, which drives tens of millions of dollars in tourism in the state, and it emanates out of Detroit and especially Port Huron. And there are folks in Port Huron that are worried about, if the boat race doesn't go, that's the biggest weekend of business in Port Huron. So, driving those kinds of tourism dollars, a break to have Mackinac Island would be toast right away. We'd have oil on the beaches of Mackinac Island. This is a really important place where I do business. We make private label beer for the Grand Hotel. And tourism could be affected for a generation to come. And it's something that we count on in our state. We welcome those tourists. We welcome people from Illinois and Indiana, Ohio, from all over the country and the world to come enjoy Michigan. And, I think that this is such an important part of our economy to take the risk of having a spill and that we would lose this part of our economy is just an untenable position.
Dr. Schreberg, we're running out of time, but I think it's important for you to speak a little bit about how we look at decommissioning pipelines, particularly with a end-of-life assessment. That if you have let's say, hypothetically, you have an old pipeline 60-plus years through one of the most sensitive areas in the country, what would be the process to do an end-of-life assessment, and what do we need to do to make that a reality?
Yeah, the problem right now is we don't have a system in place for that overall. And what you have to start doing, so we are sort of picking away at these pieces. We have incidents like what you've talked about today, really important incidents that demonstrate, okay, we have some vulnerabilities in our, sorry, can you hear me? That we have some vulnerabilities in our system right now. What we don't have is a comprehensive approach to saying, hey, if this infrastructure is beyond its design life, or is showing significant signs of wear and tear,
what is the public cost benefit test, and how do we put a life cycle assessment in there? That simply doesn't exist. It's something that we believe needs to be worked in the statute and then through regulations in PHMSA. As we heard in earlier testimony, when you asked Administrator Elliott, has a pipeline ever been shut down in operations in a situation like this? The answer was no. Surely we can't have gone through all of our history of pipelines and never had one that should be shut down. We're looking at an extreme case here right now in the Straits of Mackinac, but we need to look at what lessons that provides for the entire country. And it's really a new part of our regulatory structure is what I'm advocating for.
And based on the research that you've commissioned that has been done in terms of economic impacts, is that we have a vast network of pipelines all across the country. So it is reasonable, or is it reasonable, I should say, is it reasonable to think that if you shut down one particular portion of that, there are other ways to redirect material into key areas? You just need to have some creativity and some desire and willingness to actually search out those alternatives to make sure that we can accomplish both, provide needed material for people and for the economy and to heat homes, but we should never, ever sacrifice an environmental treasure like the Great Lakes. Is that reasonable?
Well, Senator, obviously I couldn't have said it any better myself. I think the bottom line is we know that there are alternatives for the small amount of service that Line 5 provides to the state of Michigan. We know there are no alternatives to the Great Lakes. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. Well, I am sorry that we've run out of time, a lot of time for this hearing. I want to thank again all of the witnesses for being here and for your frank assessment of the situation. It's very much appreciated. But I think we've learned an awful lot of information that I think raises, in many respects, raises more questions than answers them, which I think is part of the problem with this pipeline going across such an ecologically sensitive area. We've learned that it takes way too long to get response equipment to a site. We've learned that as a result of weather conditions, it may be impossible to use that equipment even if it is on site. We know that there are gaps in transparency. There are gaps in ways to build trust with the public when you're dealing with an issue as sensitive as this. So we have a lot of work to do. The testimony that was provided today is now part of the official record of the committee in the United States Senate. I will promise folks here who took time out of your busy schedules that this is not over. We are going to keep working to make sure that we do everything we can and ultimately make sure that we prevent any kind of oil spill from ever occurring in the Straits of Mackinac. It's absolutely unacceptable to do that. And we're going to empower the federal agencies to be more actively engaged. And certainly, Mr. Bryson, I hope that we can be more actively engaged. And my ask of you and for the company, and I had this opportunity to say this directly to your CEO when I met with him a short time ago, Enbridge must be more transparent. You must be truthful. You must be quick in response. And you need to show that you are truly going to go above and beyond the call of duty. Don't give us words. Give us action. Show us that action and put it in place. So with that, I will close the hearing just once again to reiterate that the hearing record will remain open for the next couple of weeks. Anybody who would like to submit questions, I'm sorry I didn't get to all the questions I certainly would have liked to ask. I'm sure you all have questions as well. You can submit those to the committee. You would also like your comments. Those will also be put into the official record of the Senate. As we continue to do work, we do have the reauthorization of the federal agency PHMSA. We'll be coming back to my committee where I serve as the ranking member. We'll be taking that up next year. We'll be beginning those discussions, and that gives us an opportunity to put even more work going forward. But most of all, thank you to all of you coming out today. There are a lot of other things you could be doing today on a Monday morning in the beautiful northern Michigan, but you care deeply about this state, you care deeply about this country, and you know the only way we get action in this country is by showing up and making sure our voice is heard. Thank you for being here. Meeting adjourned.